This week marked 30 years since Nelson Mandela was released from prison. He became South Africa's first democratically elected president in 1994, and the winds of change had begun to blow. Somewhere along the line, the hope that many South Africans had for a better future under government chosen by us, the people, started fading. Fast forward to the new millennium, and many are unemployed and living in poverty, and inequality is growing. Suddenly, everyone has the answers to what went wrong. And some have gone as far as insinuating that Nelson Mandela was a sellout, a man that was once considered a terrorist by the apartheid government and spent a large part of his life in prison for fighting a racist and unjust system. Then he was a hero to many of us. This morning we discussed Nelson Mandela's legacy and whether the current generation understands it in its entirety. To help us to do this, we're joined by Sonwabile Mangcochwa, who is the Chief Executive of the National Heritage Council. Sonwabile, good morning and thank you very much for your time. A lot of discussion, especially by young people sometimes on social media, about Nelson Mandela's heritage. As this week we're marking 30 years since he was released from prison, some people were questioning whether or not he sold out, he compromised too much during negotiations. In your view, is that a fair?
I think yesterday marked the 30 years, not only of release of Nelson Mandela, which was the watershed in the history of this country, but also the unbanning of the liberation movement. And recall that Nelson Mandela was not alone. There are many unsung heroes and heroines who were released in prison, but there are also those who came out of prisons, various prisons inside the country, and of course those who came back from exile. So it was that weave of the light in South Africa. So it's also very important for us to re-educate ourselves about South Africa's road to freedom. Because it was not just about Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was part of a collective. So his organization, led, of course, by him, was negotiating. And that was, if you trace the history of the ANC from Morogoro in 1969, Morogoro Conference, there was always, this, a strategic view that let's sit down with what was called the enemy at that time. And therefore, negotiations were also a terrain of the struggle itself. So it was not just about Nelson Mandela. So what's important is that sometimes we don't talk about our road to freedom, and single out Nelson Mandela. So the issue of negotiations was also, a part of the core part of the struggle. As you know, from Chief Apat Luthuli, the issue of let's sit down, and then resolve the South African conflict through talking. So what was important, about yesterday is really this, dialogue between the elderly, more especially between the elderly and call those who are called born frees post-1990 to clear the misconceptions. Remember, Oliver Tambo, in a march, in various, when he was still in exile, he would, hold the placard and say, release our leaders. Therefore, meaning that this release of leaders was not just about release Nelson Mandela. So it was release our leaders. And then coming to talk, it was not about selling out, Nelson Mandela selling out, and so it was negotiation themselves.
Yeah, I guess the context is very important, as you say, that conversation to set people straight, because Nelson Mandela became the face of resistance and the campaigning for releasing all those who were in prison. And O.R. Tambo himself, in the 80s, when he started to campaign and lobby in Southern Africa among the so-called frontline states, he was very keen to say that we need to find a negotiated settlement. Now, you can't go into negotiations if you're not willing to compromise.
Yes, Nelson Mandela was an embodiment of the South African cause. And I think this is what the leadership of the ANC had agreed, that his name was the name that was actually, resonate with the struggle of South Africa, synonymous, with the cry for South Africa. But of course, when it comes to negotiations, negotiations themselves are give and take. And sometimes we forget. That's why, our task is to ensure that we fight against forgetfulness. There were various positions in CODESA, the strategic initiative, outlined in the document called the Strategic Perspective Document, and which indeed they trace negotiations not only as an event in CODESA, but as a road to South African freedom, because the issue of talking or resolving the challenges of South Africa through talking was always there. We recall in Rivonia trial, Nelson Mandela himself even located even the whole issue of the formation of Umkhonto weSizwe, that this was something reluctant that they actually went to. Even when Umkhonto weSizwe started, they were hitting pylons, and the strict instructions given not to injure human beings. I mean, they spoke of soft targets in the 80s.
Yeah, where are we failing? Sonabile, sorry to come in. Sonabile, where are we failing in making sure, very briefly, to making sure that the millennials, the Zennials, the new generation understand all that context that you are putting so well? Because from its formation in 1912, then as known as the South African National Native Congress, the ANC was keen to engage in dialogue. The taking up arms and formation of Umkhonto weSizwe came well after, and as you said, it was a reluctant resolution by the liberation movement.
I think the question is, how do we memorialize this legacy, this heritage tapestry? This is where now we come in as these organizations, and of course talking to the youth, the dialogues that I think should go on, and of course not only once, but people visiting museums. I mean, South Africa, they're very centers where we can actually relate to this history. These museums are not just tourist attraction areas. These are reservoirs of knowledge and centers of excellence. There's Liliesleaf, for instance, in Randburg. You go to Nelson Mandela Museum, Chief Luthuli, Robben Island, and so forth. But sometimes we overemphasize on international tourism to the detriment of an informed society. So that's very important that we interact with this history, because we kind of a situation where somebody from Venezuela will actually understand South African road to freedom. And then you have not only young people, because sometimes there's this kind of say fallacy that we must also, it's only young people who are not informed across. But young people are very important, because they actually, the bearers, can I say, they are custodians of our future. Lastly, what was important yesterday, it was reconnecting with the balcony and then the square when Nelson Mandela stood. It was important to have President Cyril Ramaphosa, who is the midwife of our democracy, because he stood in that balcony with Nelson Mandela. But of course, you'll understand that he went to lead. To lead in CODESA, but of course the draft of our constitution. So it played a very important role, in the birth of our democracy. That is President Ramaphosa. It was important to have him, and actually, what's important, a very fascinating, history, in making, also history multiplying itself.
Yes.
To have him there. And then we were so lucky to have him around, because President Ramaphosa transcends different generations, as a current president.
Thank you very much. I wish we had more time. But I understand we need to have these conversations across the board. Not only young people need to hear where we've been and the context of some of the things that played out in our very important history on the road to freedom. Thank you very much, Sonwabile Mangcwatshwa, who is the CEO of the National Heritage Council. Still,